How's it going, Eliminators? Today, we're going to be finishing up the video series on the Scott's L2548 riding lawnmower. So let's get right into it. Now, I finished up part 2 by laying down the new sump gasket and installing the new crankshaft main seal. But before we go ahead and install the sump pan onto the engine, we have to look at hooking up the oil pump first. So we're going to get to that now. Now, because we had the sump pan flipped upside down, the oil pump shaft here ended up falling out. That just simply pulls out just like this. So it was just laying on my workbench. Now, it might fall out when you go ahead and remove your oil sump pan. And if that happens, you're going to have to fish it out inside of the bottom of your engine. So when you pull out your sump pan, just try to look for that little piece right there, because your engine won't pump any oil and you'll burn up an engine if you don't reinstall this, because this shaft right here with that slot is what engages with your camshaft there. So you could imagine if you don't have this, you could run into an issue where you're running your engine and it's not getting any oil. You're going to seize up your engine. Not to worry though, we're simply just going to put this off to the side now. We're going to flip the oil pan over and I'm going to remove those 3 screws that I showed you earlier for the oil pump cover, and we're simply just going to remove the oil pump. So just go ahead and remove these 3 8mm bolts. This is just a plate with an O-ring right there. So you can go and set that off to the side. And then here is our oil pump gear. So that's offset. So you could imagine it just spins around in there like this. And that's what pumps your oil. So using a pair of pliers, we're simply just going to go ahead and lift that off, put it somewhere clean. Now, you don't have to remove this piece here, because all we wanted to do was remove this gear because it has a slot in it, and we wanted to remove the shaft. So basically now we can go ahead and set down our sump pan, and then once everything's in position, we have it all bolted down and torqued to spec, which I'll get to in a minute, then you can go ahead and take the oil pump shaft and you'll be lining it up with the groove in the camshaft, and then you'll be able to put this in and rotate it until it drops down in, and then you can go ahead and take your gear and line it up to this side here, and then basically now you have everything lined up, and then we can just go ahead and put the cover on last, and then that'll be it. Now, the only thing I'm going to do before I install the sump pan is I have a little squirt bottle here with some 10W30 in here. So this is clean engine oil. All I'm going to do is put a little dab on my finger. I've already wiped the crankshaft off here, but what we're going to do is apply a thin layer of oil, and that'll just help the seal slide over the crankshaft, because what we don't want to do is put it on with the crankshaft dry and have the seal tear. So a little bit of oil goes a long way. So we have our pan on, but it's not seated yet. We're just starting to engage the dowels. So I'm just going to use my soft blow mallet here, and we're just going to go up and give it light taps all the way around here, and that should help it seat into those dowels. And you guys can see there that we're just starting to engage the oil seal. You don't have to hit it hard. All we're trying to do is give it a nice even distribution of force just to help seat it into position. And you can see now that we're pretty much all the way down. We'll go ahead and insert our bolts and torque them to spec. Okay, so I've gone ahead and put all 10 bolts into the sump, and I've just snugged them up using my impact just to kind of drive them in and get them to where we want them. So the first thing I'm going to do is start a staggered torque, which just means that I'm going to tighten one here on the bottom right corner, go up to the top left, come back down here, go over here, you know, just kind of mix it up. What we're not going to do is go one after the other all the way around. That's not what you want to do. So I'm going to start off at about 12.5 foot-pounds, and then I'm going to go up to 25 foot-pounds, which is a total of 300 inch-pounds of torque. And you're going to notice that I'm taking a little green paint marker and I'm just marking the bolts. Once it's all done, I'll be able to tell there's paint on all 10 bolts and every single one has been torqued. So just like that, every single one of the 10 oil sump bolts has now been torqued to spec. So like I said, I'm just going to line up my oil pump shaft. We're going to drop that in, rotate it until it drops down farther. Then I can go ahead and get my gears in and then the cover on. So we're going to go ahead and drop this in, and then we're going to rotate it until it seats into position right there. Now that the oil pump shaft is in, we can go ahead and drop our gear on just like that. And then with the gear on, you can go ahead and line up this guy right there. And that's it, guys. Go ahead and get the cover on and your oil pump is now installed. So I have the oil pump cover on, and I'm just going to be using a little bit of blue Permatex thread locker to help seal these bolts, because I would hate for us to spend all this time to remove the engine from the machine, you know, do a sump gasket and torque everything, new bolts, and then have this leak. So a little bit of blue thread locker will go a long way. And those have now been torqued to 50 inch-pounds. So I'm moving on to just hooking up the governor stuff here. So I've hooked up the governor to the throttle, so that rod there is hooked up, and then these were the two 10mm bolts that went in there, and then I can go ahead and hook my springs back up. Okay, so before we put our pulley back on, I wanted to clean up this rust, so I'm going to use a combination of just a brass wheel here, and I also have some emery paper, which is just really fine sandpaper. I'm going to go in there, clean it all up, make sure there's no rust on there for that pulley to bind onto. There we go. That looks a little better. So now I'm going to use some Permatex nickel anti-seize, coat that crankshaft there, and then should never have to worry about that pulley seizing on ever again. But I learned my lesson. I'm not going to be applying the nickel anti-seize to the shaft until the engine is mounted onto the front of the rider here, and that is because once you put the anti-seize on there, it becomes a little slick, so when you flip your engine upside down, the pulley has a tendency to just fall off. And then I'm going to be reaching in there, and there's going to be nickel anti-seize all over the crankshaft, and then you end up looking like the Tin Man after a short period of time. So my plan here is just to clean up all this mess, and I still have to change the drive belt. I'm not sure if I'm going to film that because this video is kind of running on. It's super simple. There's just an idler right there, and you just loop it out of the idler, loop it off of the back pulley, and then the whole belt should be able to pull forward. So it seems pretty simple. So I might do the belt now before I go ahead and mount the engine, and then at least this part will be done. I'll be able to drop it right in, hook up the new drive belt, and it'll be ready to go. So I ripped the old drive belt out of this thing, and I have the new drive belt installed. We're using a STENS True Blue, so that's going to be an Amarid. Basically, it's a Kevlar belt. So now we're ready to take the engine and put it back down. You guys can see we went and wiped up all of where the engine mounts to, especially underneath, just to try to get as much of the oil and grass residue that was there off of the engine mounting surface. So we're ready now to drop the engine back down. I've gone ahead and wiped down the PTO clutch assembly, also a little bit of Permatex nickel anti-seize inside of there so that doesn't seize up. I also picked up a couple hoses. I have the vacuum hose for the fuel pump because that one had a little crack in it, and then I have a breather tube, and that is going from the crankcase breather into the airbox, so I picked those two up as well. So once the engine is reinstalled onto the machine, I can go ahead and install those. Okay, so I got the engine dropped back in now, and when I hooked up the belt adapter there, it kept falling down. So what I did was I just went ahead and routed the new drive belt inside of the idler there, and then I took the parking brake off so that there's maximum tension on the drive belt now. So as that tightens up the drive belt, it helps hold this little adapter in place. So then I went ahead and took the plate there and put both of the engine bolts up into the engine, and I'm using some Permatex blue thread locker here on the bolts. I just wanted to go ahead and put some thread locker on to make sure that these engine bolts don't come loose. Okay, so all of my engine bolts are now torqued to spec with some blue thread locker, and I just pulled off the top cover to go ahead and replace this cracked vacuum line. I guess you can call it a breather tube that just vents from the crankcase to the back of the airbox there. So that's one of them. And then the second one is going to be the breather tube right down here from the fuel pump to the overhead valve cover. Now there's a trick to installing those, and that is simply to use a little bit of silicone lubricant. So you don't want to use anything that's going to expand or, you know, crack the rubber in the future. So using a little bit of silicone helps them slip in a little bit easier. So we're just going to take a little bit of the silicone lubricant and we're just going to spray. That should be good enough. So I now have the PTO clutch back up onto the adapter there, and you guys can see that I have plugged in my cables. I put some new crimped ends on there just to make them nice and tight. Now, if you want to test it, you can go ahead and turn the key on into the accessory position or the run position, and then go ahead and pop your PTO switch. And you guys can see that it engaged the electromagnet in there, so that means that it's working as it should. So I'm here editing the video, and I just wanted to give a quick little update on the PTO wiring. You guys can see here that what is shown isn't the proper way to wire up a PTO. Someone had some female disconnectors hooked onto it, so that's how I ended up rewiring it. I just put some new female disconnectors, but it's not the proper way to wire up a PTO. So what I did was I went out and bought an Oregon 33-159, and it's called a pigtail disconnector. And you'll see here that on one end it has a clip, so that's the end that we're going to use to plug into the PTO. And I ended up just cutting off the other connector on the top there and splicing it into the wiring harness, and then I heat shrinked those connections as well to prevent moisture from getting in. And before I plugged it in, I packed it full of some Permatex dielectric grease to further prevent corrosion. And you guys can see here that it plugs in, that little tab snaps over the top little clip on the PTO clutch, and it works perfectly. This is the way that it came from the manufacturer, so that's the way that I wanted to do it. And that part ended up costing me about $13, and like I said, it's the right way to do it, so that's the way that I did it. I've also gone ahead and swept the rubber mat underneath the mower here to see if any of the oil is leaking. And if there's no oil leaking, then that means the job is done, and I can go ahead and put the mower deck back on. Fingers crossed, nothing leaks. So I brought the machine outside and I just fired it up. I didn't get it on a video because I just wanted to make sure that it ran first. The issue that I was having though was the engine started surging up and down, but I noticed that if I put the choke onto full, that it ran just fine. So I came to the back of the tank here, and normally what you have on a fuel tank is you have the line on the bottom of the tank and it's gravity fed. So all the fuel goes to the bottom, but all of the debris goes to the bottom as well. Now what they do on these riders is they have a fuel line up on the top here, which is right in there, and then they have a pickup tube that goes down into the tank, and normally it sits like an inch or so off of the bottom so it doesn't pick up all that gunk. So right here is the pickup tube, and right there is the issue that is causing our surging. So there's a kink in the line, and it's just preventing the engine from pulling as much fuel as it needs to run on high RPM. And if you put the choke on full, then it just kind of creates more suction to pull more fuel through at a higher velocity. So I'm right now in the process of trying to figure out how to replace this, because it looks like this has a threaded fitting here, and then that goes in, and then this has a little ribbed connector here that you push the fuel line onto. So this is going to be tricky to go inside of there and get that on. Okay, so I talked with the John Deere techs, and they said that 90-degree piece there should just pull out of the tank. But unfortunately, on the original tank style, that is actually a part of the tank. So when they assemble this tank and they mold it, that's a piece that's already assembled in there. Now there's a superseded part number for a new tank, and basically what it has is, instead of the pickup there, it comes over here and it has a rubber grommet to a 90, and then you go ahead and you pull out the 90 of the rubber grommet. You can replace the rubber grommet over here if it ever leaks. So this is the original tank style. So I'm going to show you how to fix this. What we're going to do here is we're simply going to cap this original 90, and then I'm going to use this hole here, which the previous owner already drilled a hole in. So you guys might remember from the original video, the previous owner had a fuel line running from there all the way down to the engine along the top of this. And I believe now that this had a kinked line all the time. So what happened was, when we got it, we ended up just back purging the line, and we heard a little pop, and we thought it was just clogged up. So now we understand that it may have always had that little kink in it, and that's what was preventing it from running. So it was just a fuel starvation issue. So I'm using some STENS 1/4 by 1/2 fuel line. So that's a 1/4 inch inside diameter and a 1/2 inch outside diameter. And like I said, using a little bit of silicone lube here, I'm just forcing that fuel line through there. So I'm thinking something like this, guys. I got a metal 90-degree going into my 1/4 by 1/2 fuel line with a big fuel clamp on it. So now I just have to find a little rubber cap that I can put over the OEM plastic 90 there on the left. And then I'm going to redo the fuel line here because, well, it's kind of dry and cracked. So I'm going to put a new fuel line from here back down along the frame rail up until where the back of the engine is. And the fuel line here is just held in by these little plastic clips. So you just have to pinch them, and then you can pull them out of the holes in the frame. So I have the old fuel line out. I just ripped it out of the frame rail, and I have the new fuel line in. Kind of tricky, but at least now I have a new fuel line from here all the way back. And I didn't want to have to blow out the line, so I just put a bolt in the end here so that when I was fishing it through the dirty frame here, you know, it didn't get a big chunk of stuff in it. So then I can just go ahead and take that bolt out and the line will be clean. So I have my new fuel line installed and I've capped off that little 90-degree factory connector there. So this thing should fire up and run just fine now. Okay, so I'm gonna fire this thing up, see how it runs. So that's it for today's video, and that wraps up the video series on the Scott's L2548 riding lawnmower. We ended up putting in just about $800 in parts into this machine, and we just sold it recently for $1,500. My customer was super happy. The thing runs perfectly, cuts grass great, and he absolutely loves the machine. If you guys enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. You can click here to subscribe and click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week. So be sure to stop on by next week, check channel out for new content. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.